Today, my primary emphasis is going to be finishing up ancient Egypt, which today I'm mostly going to talk about the New Kingdom, which is that second major period of ancient Egypt out of the three kingdom periods. And mostly I'm going to talk about the famous pharaohs that were part of it, which, one of the first I will get to will be Queen Hatshepsut. Of course, very interesting because one of the very few female rulers they actually had in ancient Egypt. I want to go ahead and first talk about what happened with the Old Kingdom collapsed, and they had this first intermediate period. I think we already talked about all the different intermediate periods that existed in Egypt. There is a Middle Kingdom. I usually don't go into the Middle Kingdom that much. It's not as famous as the Old and New Kingdoms, but the Middle Kingdom was around for about 400 or 500 years. It collapsed too, and then there was like the so-called second intermediate period that came in, and it was dominated by this period I'm going to get to in a second that was called the Hyksos invasion, where these Semitic people from Asia came in and took over Egypt between like the 17th and the 16th centuries. The Middle Kingdom did have pyramids too. Like there was pyramids being built up to like the 12th dynasty. I think the last major kings that built pyramids were Amenemhet the first, second, and third. It was like a dynasty of kings. And I think at Dashur in Hawara, which is like south of where Fayum is, which is like an oasis area in the western central part of Egypt. That's mostly where they built pyramids, but they weren't built very well. They later collapsed and all of that. So anyway, let me get, of course, to the main thing we need to talk about. So they have the New Kingdom that comes in, but before that actually happened, there was a period in ancient Egypt, which is the so-called second intermediate period, which happened between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. See kind of like those gaps there, like 1640. So like 17th century down to about the 6th century, there was a period where they had these people called the Hyksos that came in and they took over Egypt. And who were the Hyksos? They were kind of like Canaanites. They're usually kind of seen as some kind of Semitic type people from Asia. And Semitic people are Asiatic peoples. They came out of southwestern Asia. They're like from Saudi Arabia up into Syria and all that. And they took over Egypt for about a century or so. And they go by different names. Some believe that the Greeks called them Hyksos, which mean the translation it varies, but foreign kings, or the common other name they use is also rulers of foreign lands. And this is a name that the historian Manetho wrote about. Manetho, I think I mentioned before, was this, he was a priest and historian that lived during the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. And he wrote a history of Egypt that was called History of Egypt, or the Greek name is also Egyptica. Anyway, most of the sources on him come from this writer named Flavius Josephus, who I mentioned about. I wrote my dissertation, by the way, on Josephus. If you wonder about that. Josephus lived about 2,000 years ago. He was a Roman historian who was Jewish, and he wrote several books, like the Jewish Antiquities, I think is the most famous one. Hey, Chris. But he's he's got like fragments of the book in his book. It's called Against Apion. It's called, that's where we get our information about the Hyksos, like who they are and all of that. And they ruled Egypt for, like I said, about a century. Like they were actually a dynasty, the 15th dynasty, they were called. They ruled most of the Delta area, like the lower part of Egypt. Josephus calls them shepherd kings. And I think a bunch of other people kind of use that name as well, because Josephus had this theory that the Hyksos were somehow descended from the Israelites, somehow related to them, but they're not sure if that's true or not. Manetho in Josephus' book Against Apion has this story they talk about sometimes. You may have heard of it. It's called the story of Osarseph. And Sarseph was believed to be some kind of renegade priest that rebelled against one of the pharaohs of Egypt, who went by the name Amenephis, which Amenephis they think was a Greek name, or Amenhotep, which Amenhotep was like four of those pharaohs with that name, 1 through 4, that reigned Egypt in the 18th dynasty. And Manetho thought that Osarseph was Moses, because in the story, he supposed he changed his name to Moses or something like that. And but they're not sure if that story is the same story that's in the Old Testament in the Exodus. So it's kind of a debate about that. What they know about the Hyksos, they had war chariots they brought in, of course, drawn with horses. So they introduced horses to Egypt. They also brought in the composite bow. So that enabled them to kind of control, the region for a short time. And the Egyptians had to learn how to fight, using this kind of new form of warfare. Eventually, they turned the tables on them over time, but it'll take like a century or so until they eventually drive them out, which they do. And that's when they start talking about this king that came in later, whose name is Ahmose the First. Suppose they were like a brother duo. There was another pharaoh named Kamos. Yeah, Kamos and Ahmose, kind of rhymes. And they were both brothers and were pharaohs. And they think Ahmose is more famous. He's the one that supposedly drove out the Hyksos. They think maybe close to about 1550 BC or BCE. And so he drove them back into Syria and all that. And so they think Ahmose is important because he's seen as the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. He's the one that founded the new kingdom that comes in after, that ends the second intermediate period. So that's why he's famous. I don't know if they know as much about him as some of the other pharaohs that are later. But so he was considered like the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. And the new kingdom itself only has 3 dynasties. It's got the 18th, it's got the 19th, and it's got the 20th dynasties. The 18th dynasty has different nicknames. They usually call it the Tutmosid dynasty. That's what they usually call it. And it was called that because of the fact that you had like 4 rulers at one point that went by the name Tutmosis. Really, Tutmos the First, you see in that list up there below Ahmose, was really considered the first famous ruler they had of the actual New Kingdom, 18th dynasty. And then the 19th and the 20th dynasties are usually called the Ramessid dynasty. And it's called that because of the fact that you had so many rulers of those 2 dynasties that were named Ramses, including Ramses II or Ramses the Great, the most famous one. And they start a lot of the pharaohs started putting more emphasis on the god Ra again. So that's why they were called Ramses. Other things that's famous about the New Kingdom I wanted to mention about, which we'll be talking more about later. The New Kingdom was very famous for establishing the Valley of the Kings, which became like a burial complex that's located in western Thebes. And it was first started by the 3rd pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, Thutmose the First, who, by the way, was the father of Queen Hatshepsut later. And one thing that's very famous, about the Valley of the Kings is that it was they tried to hide all their tombs. Like before with the pyramids, they all got robbed. About this. And so the Egyptians came up with this idea to build rock cut tombs that were cut out of the bedrock of mountains, kind of like mining. They dig tunnels into the earth and then build tombs and hide them. So they did this in western Thebes, which is kind of on the west bank across from where the modern city of Luxor is, which Luxor is where ancient Thebes was in ancient Egypt, which was kind of like a capital of Egypt by the New Kingdom. So I think 62 tombs have been found in the Valley of the Kings. And of course, the only one that was, found intact, if you know about this, was King Tut's tomb, which was found in 1922. Which we'll get to that later about King Tut and Howard Carter and all that. Also, I was talking about Thebes, where Luxor is today. Thebes, of course, became like one of the main capitals of Egypt, especially like a religious capital. It's kind of like a theocracy, really. And that became like the cult center of the god Amun, which I told you Amun was like their chief state god. They worshiped the most. And it's at that site that in the 18th dynasty, they started, constructing the so-called Karnak temple complex, which was one of the largest temples ever built in the world, like close to 250 acres in size. It was built over like successive rulers, like between like the 18th, I think, up to like the 19th dynasty constructed it. I think in that video later, they'll go into more detail about the Karnak temple complex, but a lot of the priests there that ran it, like the temple of Amun, Karnak temple complex, were very powerful. Egypt became like a theocracy. I know the pharaohs were kind of seemed like living gods, but a lot of the priests had probably almost more power than he did, really. One more thing about the New Kingdom that's famous as well. The New Kingdom was also an empire building period. It's sometimes called the New Empire, I think is sometimes a name I've seen. They call it the New Kingdom. And this empire was like almost double the size of like the Old Kingdom. Like Old Kingdom was mostly like from like maybe southern Egypt, where the Delta is, in maybe part of Libya. But this empire stretched down into like the Sudan, which the Egyptians called Nubia. They included Libya. They took over Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan. So it pretty much went, I think, as far east, I want to say, as the Euphrates River at one point, then up into like Syria today, like Western Syria mostly. And I think I told you they competed heavily with the Hittites up in like Turkey and all that, up to like the time of Ramses the Great. So their empire was like double in size, compared to like what it was before with the old kingdom. I think I've got some other slides on here if you want to look at them later that I've got. You can see the mountainous area, of course, where the Valley of the Kings. There's actually a Valley of the Queens too, where they buried a lot of female nobility as well. And I think the only woman that was buried in the Valley of the Kings, of course, if you know about that, was Queen Hatshepsut, who, of course, we'll talk about today. So, yeah, let me talk about her for a few minutes, which there's going to be more like in that video documentary you'll watch later that goes more into Hatshepsut. Yeah, she was the fifth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. That's her, a statue of her on the right. She was famous for kind of wearing like men's clothing to kind of look more like a male type ruler as a whole. And she was the daughter of Tutmos I, or Tutmos I, either way. He was like a really powerful pharaoh. So she obviously learned a lot from her father, I guess, about reigning more or less. She's one of like at least three major pharaohs that have been female under the Egyptians. The other is Nefertiti, you see there, who was later the wife of Akhenaten, who I'll talk about later, who kind of reigned briefly as pharaoh. And then Cleopatra, who's really Greek, of course, reigned under the Ptolemaic dynasty at the end of the 1st century BC. But they say she's the most powerful, really, out of all the different female pharaohs that actually ruled at one point. She reigned over 20 years, like 21 or 22 years, I think, was how long her reign was mostly. Now, she wasn't supposed to reign, if you know about this. Her husband was the actual pharaoh, Tutmos II, who I think was her half-brother she married. And he died young, and they had a son named Tutmos III, who was supposed to be the pharaoh. I think he was just like an infant or toddler, I think, when her husband died. And then over, like, I guess the couple years after, she basically took over and was the de facto ruler that really ruled over the state. By the way, Tutmosis III was a pretty good ruler too. He reigned a long time. I want to say 30, 40 years or more. And he was known for his military conquests. I think a lot of the expansion of the New Kingdom took place mostly under Tutmosis III, who sometimes was called, by the way, Egypt's Napoleon, because he was kind of seen as this military genius. I think was short too, like Napoleon maybe. And he was known for conquering like Nubia, like in southern Egypt, and the Sudan. And then he pushed up in this, I think up in as far north as like Syria at one point. So he's well known. And I think Tutmosis III may have erased a lot of history about Queen Hatshepsut. Even defaced her statues, and I think they even took some of her statues and had them buried, things like that, because he didn't want anybody to know that there had been a female ruler at one point. Yeah, that video kind of talked about that, and they'll talk more about in that video, that documentary later. But yeah, she did expand trade. It's kind of a debate about where it is in Africa, but I'm thinking close to like Ethiopia and Somalia, an area called Punt, P-U-N-T, that they traded with. And so that, and then probably trade extended up into Syria, Syria, Lebanon, in those areas as well. So it was like a golden age, really, in her reign when she was in power. All right. Then, of course, the other thing that she's very famous for, probably the most famous thing now, is her temple that she eventually constructed, which is the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, that they think was built sometime in the 15th century. And it was actually designed by this royal steward and architect named Senamut. I think they'll talk more about him in that documentary you'll watch later. But it was kind of like this futuristic type temple that they think came the closest to like the classical architecture you see like in the Greek Roman world, more or less. And it had like, I think it's got at least 2 levels to it. And it's got a lot of square-faced columns with it where they put like statues of the god Osiris, which is like the god of the dead, king of the dead. And it's famous for its causeway running up to the top of it, as you can see. And here's another picture of it right here. It has been reconstructed. I think since, I want to say, the 1960s, they've been trying to rebuild or reconstruct it. So that's basically how they think it looked like. I think they took some of the material to build it from like this other temple over here, which is mostly just ruins. So, so yeah, you can see how it's reconstructed. And they've even tried to kind of redo some of the statues with it also as well. This has probably all been rebuilt though. So that's basically what she's famous for now. They have different names for that temple, by the way. I think it has multiple names. The common name that the Arabs would call it, by the way, was Deir al-Bari. Is one of the names they called it. And there's another one called Zezeru, I think is another name that they called it, which I think it meant Holy of Holies, I think is what the temple supposedly meant. Deir al-Bari meant, in Arabic, I think it meant the northern monastery, because at one point they actually had, the Copts, the Christian Copts had used the temple as like a church or monastery, hence the name being used. Well, yeah, Senamut, I'll put him on the screen again. They think he's the one that rebuilt it, built it, and they think he was a steward where he took care of like some of Hatshepsut's children or something like that. And there's a debate about Senamut and Hatshepsut being like possible lovers. I don't know if this is true. I think they'll show something more about that in that video later you'll watch, but it's a possibility that could happen because she never remarried Hatshepsut after her husband died. All right, let me go ahead and move on to, and I'll talk about some other pharaohs that were also famous. They have another pharaoh that's well known, who comes in the 14th century, whose name is Akhenaten, they called him, whose original name was, by the way, Amenhotep IV, they called it. And I believe he was the, if I look it up real quick, he was the 10th pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. He did have a nickname that a lot of the Egyptians called him, so I'll put it on the screen for you, but it was basically the heretic is what they called him. And back for a while, I think they discovered later that the Egyptians struck him from the record of various kings of Egypt. That's how much they hated this pharaoh. He was very radical, and he was radical because he, if you know much about Akhenaten, he was well known for developing this monotheistic cult, which was based on a god that was called Aten, the Aten, which I'll put on the screen for you. The Aten was called the sun disk god. You can see that banner on the slide on the bottom there, and it's a type of god that had been around a while, and I think it went back to the Old Kingdom. It's kind of similar to like a sun god, similar to like the god Amun, but it was not very well known. And apparently, Akhenaten was kind of mad about the fact that the cult of Amun had so much power, like with the priests. They were at Karnak. And what I think the theory about Akhenaten, what he was trying to do, he was trying to give more power to the pharaoh. And what way to do that would be to have his own religious cult and make everybody worship that god. And so that's what he did. And so his reign has often been called the Amarna period, because what happened was, if you know about this, he first of all he changed his name, which supposedly his name meant Akhenaten meant effective to the Aten, and he moved the capital, which was at Thebes, to a place called we called it Akhetaten, but it was a place called Tel El Amarna, which is what the Arabs call it in Middle Egypt. It's like in the central part of Egypt, halfway between like where Cairo and Luxor is today. Akhetaten meant city of the horizon of the Aten. He built this massive city there that was made of mud brick, including an outdoor temple where everybody could worship this sunlight god. And you can see in that image there on the right, you can see Aten. Excuse me, you can see the Aten sun disk right here, and then you got Akhenaten worshiping it with his family. Supposedly, how the religion worked was that he and his family would worship the god, and everybody would worship him. So it's still kind of like he's still kind of seen as like a living god, basically. And a lot of pictures that he's kind of like deformed, which I think may have gotten from probably inbreeding. So some people believe that Akhenaten was kind of ugly, like an ugly, very ugly person. And then his wife was very beautiful, which his wife, if you know about this, was the famous Queen Nefertiti. That's like his maiden wife, who's, by the way, her name meant supposedly the beautiful one has come. That's what her name means. And she is considered to be one of the most beautiful women of ancient Egypt. They found statues of her, which were found at some kind of workshop that was at the Amarna site in Middle Egypt. So there's like one, I guess the one that's the very famous one is the one you're looking at. It's the same statue, just different angle. If they found that statue of her from that Amarna site, and then there's even like found like nude statues of her like right here. So she was probably worshipped too, almost like a goddess as well. So she lived sometime like around the 1330s. And that's like when she may have been like a brief pharaoh, because after her husband died, she apparently reigned briefly before King Tut came in, because Tutankhamun, was the next ruler that came in after her. So they believe she was extensively involved with the Amun cult, the Aten cult as well. But after she died, the cult died pretty much with them. And the Egyptians pretty much, like I said, struck, Akhenaten from the record of kings of Egypt. And they got rid of that cult. And they went back to the old cults. So that's the next thing that happens, of course, in Egypt is you've got, of course, the famous, King Tut comes in. The next pharaoh, Tutankhamun, as he's called, or Tutankhamun, also said that way as well. Of course, King Tut is considered to be one of the last major pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. There were two other pharaohs that reigned afterwards, which were named A and Horemheb, which those two, by the way, were ministers or advisors to King Tut that kind of helped him rule. Because if you know about King Tut, he reigned at a very young age. What was he known for? I'll kind of talk about what he was known for first during his reign, and we'll get to more why he's famous because of his actual tomb that they find later. King Tut's mostly known for his reestablishment of Thebes. So they brought back the capital. They moved everything back from Amarna to Thebes. They also reestablished the cults that were associated with the god Amun. They got rid of the Aten god, didn't worship that one. Also, he changed his name. Originally, his real name was actually, you can go up here, he was actually called Tutankhaten. They do think that he was the son of Akhenaten. That's been debated for a bunch of years until recent. But now from DNA, they've figured out that he's related to Akhenaten as his son. But he changed his name to Tutankhamun, which you see right here. So he went from having the Aten's name right here to Amun's name. He did not reign very long. I think they seem to think that he reigned somewhere between about 8 to 10 years. And so, as you know, because he was, very young as a king, he was known as the boy king. So the name stuck. And so it's more of a modern name. They started calling him in the 20th century, more or less. King Tut, like I said, is more known for his tomb that they found, of course, in 1922. Now, you could say he's almost famous more for being, dead with his tomb than, when he was alive during his reign. And the questions of his death, I did want to talk about that before I get to his tomb. Of course, there's a lot of questions about, what killed King Tut. He died, they think, around the age of 18. And caused the debate are either natural causes or he may have been murdered. They have that theory that's still there, more or less. And if you know much about King Tut, he had all kinds of health problems. They think this was caused by inbreeding, which a lot of the Egyptian royal families were known for. And they do think he had malaria. In fact, he had one of the oldest cases of malaria they've ever found in ancient history. They think he had some kind of club foot. They think he had epilepsy also as well. They also found, I think one of his legs was fractured, and they found gangrene in one of his legs. And they also found a fracture in the back of his skull. There's been a debate about what happened with that because they did some X-rays on him years ago, and they found the fact that he's got some kind of blow to the back of the skull, which they think that it was possibly from an accident, or there's another theory that he may have been hit in the back of the head on purpose and killed. And I think you heard theories that the Pharaoh A, who came after, may have had him murdered and took over because King Tut's tomb is very small. And so it was obviously his death was, wasn't supposed to happen. So now let's talk about the thing that he's famous for, of course, King Tut. And of course, the thing he's well known for, if you know about it, is his tomb, which in 1922 was found by the famed British archaeologist named Howard Carter. Howard Carter, had been around in ancient Egypt doing a lot of archaeological work since I think the 1890s as a whole. And it was found in November of 1922, often called KV 62. the last tomb found, of course, in the Valley of the Kings. And a lot of people knew that this tomb existed. This king had been a real king, but nobody had ever found the actual tomb. So I think there had been some maybe pieces of the puzzle that I think they found artifacts that were kind of linked to him. I know right before that, but they didn't really know much about the tomb existed or not. And there was a very wealthy English lord. You may have heard of him, named Lord Carnarvon, who was very interested in ancient Egypt. He had gone to Egypt multiple times, taken a lot of pictures of it. And his real name is George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. You may have heard of him. He's the one that owned that famous castle called Highclere Castle in England. You ever see that TV show called Downton Abbey? Yeah, Downton Abbey. It's filmed at that actual castle that he owned, Highclere Castle. And anyway, he is the one that basically financed the whole excavation, the digs, of course, that went into discovering King Tut's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. This time it took years for them to do. I think they started in 1908 trying to search for it. World War I kind of got in the way. So it took 14 or 15 years for them to actually find the actual tomb itself. Like I said, the tomb was the thing that's why the tomb is so famous, if you know about it. It was found mostly intact, although they do think that it had been broken into at one point. Like maybe some people were trying to rob it, but it was resealed. And apparently debris that was above the tomb from other tombs that were robbed buried the entrance to where it was, like a staircase that was going down to where the tomb entrance is. And so for some reason, they got lucky and the tomb was never plundered. So all the other tombs were, robbed. And so that's why King Tut's tomb is so famous, because of all of its treasure was still pretty much in there. Got some other pictures, of course, of King Tut's tomb. Very small chamber. Only had 4 chambers, of course, in it. It's kind of annexed in an antechamber, you can see. There's also a burial chamber. And then they also have a treasury, of course, where they found all the treasure, of course, of King Tut's tomb. Of course, the most famous thing they found was his 3 coffins that he had with his actual mummy still in the coffin. There's Howard Carter with King Tut's, of course, mummy. Of course, the most famous thing that they found with King Tut's tomb was his royal death mask, which they think all pharaohs probably had some kind of death mask like that that was put on their mummy, which this one was mostly made of solid gold. They believe that King Tut had a wife, which was Akhenamun. You may have heard of her. That's their mummies right there. And you may have heard of the name Akhenamun. She is a character that you ever seen the Mummy movies? Yeah, she's a character in the Mummy movies. She's like the one that the mummy's trying to bring back to life, that kind of thing. So that's who she is. They had 2 children together, by the way, but they died, I think, in infancy. Yeah, they found 3 really sarcophagus, I guess is the term they used, the coffins that they found in his tomb. And they were made of wood and gold, you can see. And each one, by the way, weighed 200 pounds. That's amazing. So it's obviously that these kings were very wealthy that they had. Here's another picture of one of them right here that weighed about 200 pounds. That's the actual throne that he sat on, King Tut. I've actually seen the death mask years ago. It was when I was really young. I think a teenager, I think it was. It was touring the United States, and I think I saw it in New Orleans or something like that. But I saw it one time. I've never actually been to Egypt, but I've seen the death mask though. But anyway, one more thing, of course, about King Tut's tomb that is real famous. that I need to talk about. You may have heard about the curse of the mummy or the curse of Pharaoh. Some people also call it the curse of King Tut's tomb. It's called all kinds of names. And apparently, after they opened the tomb up in early 1923, there were instances where people that went into the tomb, whether they're workers or visitors or whatever, mysteriously die. Like I want to say like a dozen people or more may have died at one point, including, by the way, Lord Carnarvon, supposedly after the tomb was open, died of an infected mosquito bite. You can get that. And so it was kind of strange about that. And there was a side story that they talk about that happened. Supposedly, one of the workers had given Howard Carter a canary bird as good luck, and a cobra killed it. You know, a cobra is like associated with the pharaohs. You can see the cobra on his death mask there. So who knows about that one? And of course, it became a sensation. The media took off with it and said there was a curse on the tomb, and that anybody that goes in the tomb is going to die. And so that's what led to all those mummy movies being made. That the mummy's going to come back to life and all that stuff. And but they think a lot of it's bunk, it's made up stuff. But sounds like a great story, though. You know, if you think about it. But King Tut's tomb was probably considered one of the greatest discoveries of archaeology, probably on ancient Egypt. So I don't know what would happen if they would have found it. So that's interesting about that. All right, let me go ahead and move on. I need to talk about one more. Usually with Egypt, I talk a little bit about the 19th, 20th dynasty, which I told you was the so-called Ramessids that you got. I usually spend a little time talking about Ramses the Great. And Ramses the Great was really considered the greatest pharaoh of the New Kingdom. He's really the peak ruler of their empire. And he was like the third pharaoh of the 19th dynasty who reigned in the 13th century, 1200s. And I think his grandfather was the one who's Ramses the First that founded the 19th dynasty. And then they had also another pharaoh who was his father. You may have heard of Seti the First, right? Seti the First, famous pharaoh, which you'll see later, I think, in that documentary. Seti the First built the largest tomb in the Valley of the Kings. It's huge. And anyway, Ramses is considered famous for a lot of different things. First of all, they think he's one of the longest reigning pharaohs in Egypt's history. I think he's up there one or two. There might be one more they think that lived in I want to say the Old Kingdom, maybe a little longer than him, but he reigned like 66 or 67 years. So he was in power a very long time. And because of the fact that he lived so long and the fact that he had so many children, he was often called the Great Ancestor. That's what all the ancient Egyptians dubbed him. And the Greeks had another nickname for him. They called him Ozymandias. You heard of that name because of a famous short poem that was done by the British poet Percy Shelley. You've heard that same poem, which is talking about this pharaoh more or less if you read it. And anyway, he did have a lot of children. He had something like 100 children or more that he had. He had multiple wives. I think I've got a picture of his wife, if you want to see his main wife anyway. Her name was Nefertari. You can see there. That's on a stone column in Abu Simbel temple in southern Egypt. That's his most favorite wife that he had a bunch of children with. But he was believed to have numerous wives, a bunch of concubines. He was kind of like the Egyptian Solomon with all the different women and all that. And he had a tomb built, which I had up on the screen. It was called KV5. I don't know if you've heard of KV5, but KV5 was a famous tomb that he built in the Valley of the Kings, which was built to bury all of his sons. She had like something like 50 sons or more. he outlived them all. He outlived his sons, and I think he outlived his grandsons also as well, believe it or not. So they used to say that Ramses lived to be almost like 90-something years old. I don't know if that's true or not. I know he was a teenager when he came to the throne, so it's possible he reigned into his 80s. He was that old. Now, is he the pharaoh in the Exodus story? They don't really know for sure. That's why I've got a question mark on that slide right there. They don't know if he's really the pharaoh or not. I mean, if you study about the Exodus, the second book in the Old Testament, there's no mention really about the pharaoh's name. So it depends all when Moses lived. If Moses lived at the same time, obviously it's possible that he could have been the pharaoh. So they don't know for sure. I think that like a lot of these Hollywood movies, have you ever seen the Prince of Egypt or the Ten Commandments or whatever? Ramses is a good character, I guess, because, he lived so long and such a powerful ruler. But you also have like 11 rulers that have the name Ramses. So it could have been any of those Ramses, more or less. The other thing that Ramses is known for, he's known for his building projects, which he and his father completed the famous, what they call the hypostyle hall. I think I've got a picture of part of the hall. I know the video you'll watch, the documentary you'll watch later, will go more into about the hypostyle hall, which was the largest part of the temple complex at Karnak. I think the columns were like 70 feet tall. Ridiculous how big those columns are, which were there to hold up the roof of the actual temple complex, like the main sanctuary of it, I guess. And so he and his father supposedly completed it sometime in the 13th century. So then the other thing he's known for, which is real famous, he's, of course, famous for his rock-cut temples that he built in southern Egypt near Sudan, right above Sudan in southern Egypt, near Lake Nasser. And there's one that's called the Temple of Ramses the Great at Abu Simbel. That's the one that's the most famous one. He built like several of these rock-cut temples down there. And the temples were actually constructed to honor not just himself, but the god Ra, like both of them pretty much. And you can see that Ramses was kind of this egotistical ruler. He really wanted to tell everybody who he was, and he was the king. And there's like statues of him all over Egypt that he erected. Some like really tall, and these you're looking at right here were built to a height of about 69 feet. So it includes like these 69-foot statues. And I don't know if you know much about it, but it was built near what is Lake Nasser. In the 1960s, they built the Aswan High Dam, which dammed the Nile River, and it formed that huge lake, now called Lake Nasser. It was named after a president of Egypt, Gamal Nasser. And what happened was they had to move it. So if you know about this, in the 1960s, they actually cut it out. They moved it further up the mountain, I guess, higher up, so it wouldn't get flooded and all that. And apparently after they moved the temple, you can see that one on the left there, it fell down, part of it. They never fixed it. So it's just still there. So they have statues on the inside that are also pretty tall as well that they cut out. They cut out the inside of too, inside the temple. So yeah, he was a very egotistical type ruler, like I said, very powerful, and probably the last great ruler they really had. Also, he had this other temple he was known for building, which is called the Ramesseum. These are what they call it. It was built in western Thebes, and this became his mortuary temple, where basically his body would be brought to be, mummified before he's buried in the Valley of the Kings. Also, the temple was built to honor the god Osiris, the king of the dead. I think it was used for different things. I heard a story it was used as a library at one point by later Egyptians. I know that. And the name Ramesseum was coined by Jean-Francois Champollion, who later came to Egypt, the guy that, translated the Rosetta Stone. And Champollion was considered one of the first early Egyptologists that began studying the ancient Egypt and all that. So yeah, it was built in Western Thebes, across from Luxor. There's supposedly a statue there that's well known. The whole thing was made of siltstone. That's the material they used to construct it. But suppose there was a huge statue of Ramses the Great that was on the site called the Colossal Ramses the Great that was like, I want to say close to 40 feet tall that he erected. And that might be what Percy Shelley's talking about, the fact that, all this, everything's in ruins, including his statue and all that. And so that was, of course, Ramses the Great. And they did have other pharaohs later, like if you go like up to like the 20th dynasty, they do have a Ramses III who comes in later. And I think he's in the next century, which would be, I think he ruled, I want to say around the 12th century BC. He's really considered to be the last great pharaoh that they have of the New Kingdom, because after that, Egypt starts to decline. Like you get down to the 11th century, Egypt starts declining in the Iron Age. And, other powers are just more powerful than Egypt is. There's really, you get all these other states that come in, like the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. And so Egypt is occupied by foreign powers, like up to modern times. It's like basically a region that's part of other states. So that's pretty much the history of, most of ancient Egypt. Like I primarily talked about, the old and the new kingdoms and all that. That's pretty much where my first exam material is going to end. I know I've got to cover later about the Phoenicians, the Israelites, and also about the Persian Empire, like the early history of the Persian Empire. I'll get to that later, probably next week, but I'm thinking on Monday coming up next week, which I believe is February the 8th, I'm going to do like a review over all the study guide sections. If you want to ask me questions, during when I review that, you can, or later. But I'll probably be giving you your first exam sometime next week, probably starting Monday. So that's it for this week lecture-wise. I guess I don't see any questions in here today. I don't know if anybody else had any other questions but like I said, if anybody has a question, of course, about the lectures, let me know later through my YouTube channel. Just if you got a historical question about something, if it's an administrative question, you can just, of course, email me. So that's it for today. I hope y'all have a great rest of the week and weekend coming up. Like I said, I'll see you Monday next week for, of course, an upcoming review for the first exam. Don't forget, you've got 2 new Canvas quizzes, right? You got 1 new Canvas quiz right now, which is on that video quiz. And then, of course, don't forget the one on Mesopotamia will expire tomorrow. So y'all have a good weekend coming up, and I'll see you later.